Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and today I want to talk about an interesting personality, one William E. Fairbairn. A lot of people are familiar with Fairbairn from his work in World War II. He and his longtime close friend Eric Sykes their name is particularly associated with a fighting knife that they developed, the Fairbairn Sykes Commando knife, which was adopted by British commandos during World War II and remains to this day a very iconic and notable knife design. People may know that Fairbairn was in charge of hand-to-hand and combat training, close quarters training and hand-to-hand training for British commandos, British SOE. During World War II, he was seconded to the United States, where he taught all of this sort of thing to the OSS. His techniques were picked up by the Marine Corps. His techniques were taught to individual American soldiers in England during World War II, as well as specifically to the 1st Army Rangers. Many of them were picked up by the Marine Corps, although that often predates his work in World War II. Some of his students include some really well-known names like Rex Applegate, who would go on to teach combat tactics, hand-to-hand and close-quarters combat tactics for the US military for a long time. The guy's really pretty famous, but I think it's worth talking about where his experience came from, because to my mind, the work that he did in Shanghai is even more interesting than what he did in England during World War II. He is, in fact, highlighted in a small section that we've added in, thanks to breaking through a stretch goal, in my upcoming book, Pistols of the Warlords, on Chinese Warlord-era domestic handgun production. If you're interested in that book, including, by the way, some really good photographs and content on one of the Shanghai Municipal Police Colt 1908 pistols, as specifically ordered and modified by Fairbairn, you can check out our ongoing Kickstarter for the book. There's some cool stuff there. But to go back to Fairbairn, so he was born in Britain. He joined the Royal Marine Light Infantry in 1901 at the age of 15 and 10 months. Apparently he walked past a recruiting station, and the recruiter asked him how old he was, and he said, "Oh, I'm 15 and 10 months." And the recruiter went, "Nonsense, you look 18, you should join up." And he did. So his date of birth was falsified as being 1884 instead of 1880, or 1883 instead of 1886. It was falsified by 3 years. He joined up apparently during basically the period British equivalent of boot camp. He grew 3 inches because, well, he wasn't really fully grown when he actually enlisted. In 1903, he was deployed off to Asia and ended up in the Legation Guard in Seoul, which is to say the guard for effectively the British Embassy in Seoul, Korea. And it was there that he got his first taste of Oriental martial arts, shall we say. And this came in the form of a Japanese the Japanese Legation Guard, which was located very close to the British Guard. Japan and Britain were allies at this time and would remain so through World War I. Apparently the Japanese bayonet fencing team challenged the British Guard team to a tournament of bayonet fencing and proceeded to completely wipe the floor with them by doing all sorts of things that the British team considered completely uncivilized and unsportsmanlike. They then immediately, the British team, went back, started training on all of these uncivilized techniques. There's an interesting side note that apparently one of the guys who was involved in some of this eventually rotated back to Great Britain and was pretty good at bayonet fighting and got into a formal tournament in the UK where he was thrown out for unsportsmanlike behavior for yelling at his opponent and hitting him with the butt of the rifle. Again, the British would before too long, they would come around and start changing up some of their bayonet fighting training. At any rate, that was Fairbairn's first introduction to Japanese and Chinese martial arts, and he took a keen interest in it. So by 1907, he had taken a job as a constable with the Shanghai Municipal Police. And it's worth commenting a bit on what Shanghai was at this time, because Shanghai was not just a Chinese city, it was also a city that had an international settlement, quote unquote. This was on 8 square miles of land that had been ceded to a couple of foreign powers in the 1840s, primarily Britain. By the time we're talking about, by the 20th century, the international settlement in Shanghai is a combination of British, American, and French, basically colonial territory. This is territory in China that is legally and officially the property of these foreign nations, and they set up what became a really thriving, cosmopolitan, dynamic international center there. There was a tremendous amount of international business that went on because, well, there was a huge foreign influence. This was a trade port. By the 1930s, the international settlement had 44,000 or so foreign residents, which is to say everything except Chinese. So this included Americans, British, Frenchmen, Germans, Japanese, Russians. There were a lot of white Russian Civil War refugees who made their way into China during this time. You'll see those in a number of contexts in the Warlord era. There were some of the northeastern provinces where the warlords in power there actually recruited whole units of Russian Cossacks who had come over the border after the Russian Civil War. At any rate, Shanghai, the international settlement, had about 44,000 foreign residents in 8 square miles and over 1 million Chinese residents. By far, the majority of the population was Chinese. There was nothing that excluded Chinese citizens from living in the international settlement. The Shanghai, this was an area, a municipality that was controlled by the Shanghai Municipal Council, which was a group of basically representatives of the foreign powers that controlled the actual land. So all the way back in 1853, they had originally formed the Shanghai Municipal Police to essentially enforce Western laws in the international settlement. By 1937, the municipal police had something like 4,700 officers, and again, about 3/4 of them were Chinese. There was a large contingent of Sikhs in the municipal police. Obviously, that was from the influence of the British Empire. There were a substantial number of Russian officers. There were Japanese officers, French, British, Scottish, Irish, American, you name it. It was a truly international police force. So William Fairbairn joins the Shanghai Municipal Police as a constable in 1907, and he's going to walk the beat for about 3 or 4 years. During which time, and I'm not sure exactly when, he wandered into a rough neighborhood of town and was beset upon by a gang of essentially ruffians. They beat the crap out of him, and he woke up in a hospital the next morning and decided to take up the study of jiu-jitsu, which was a common enough practice in China and Japan at the time. But he really dedicated himself to it and proceeded to train daily for 3.5 years and become really quite good at this. Now, in 1910, he was promoted from a beat constable to drill and musketry officer. And so he started overseeing a lot of the combat tactics, the firearms practice and firearms maintenance of the municipal police. And at that time, it was really not so great. The range facilities were iffy. A lot of the guns were wearing out. And Fairbairn was of such a mind to fix a lot of this, to reform the armament side of the Shanghai police. And he got into this pretty heavily. I will add here, in 1916, apparently, he also took up the study of judo. By 1931, he had received a 2nd-degree black belt in jiu-jitsu, Shinshin-ryu, which, I'll be quite honest, I've pulled that out of my book references. I could not tell you exactly the details of the Shinshin-ryu school of jiu-jitsu, but pretty prestigious school of martial arts in Japan, run through a university called the Kodokan, which presented Fairbairn with his 2nd-degree black belt in 1931, one of the very first Westerners to actually receive this honor. This was a 2nd-degree black belt in today's world isn't all that impressive. In 1931, it was really quite remarkable. Fairbairn took hand-to-hand combat and martial arts quite seriously, and he would develop a whole system of combined martial arts techniques, both for individual self-defense and also specifically for the police, for restraining fugitives, for capturing people, that sort of thing. He would eventually write a number of books on this subject, but the first one was actually published in 1925 in Shanghai as a manual for the Shanghai Municipal Police. But I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit here. In 1917, there was an incident in Shanghai where a number of officers were on patrol. They had a stop and frisk, essentially, policy where they would randomly search people for arms. And while we will see that as a violation of basic civil rights here in the United States, it was treated as a pretty effective law enforcement tool for reducing criminal problems in Shanghai. I should say Shanghai during this time, and especially by the 1930s, had a huge crime problem. This was, kind of like you would expect from a bustling, massively international trade center with visiting merchants and sailors from all over the world, as well as local Chinese gangs interested in getting in on the drug trade and all sorts of everything associated with an international port. They had huge issues with prostitution, with drug use, with kidnapping in particular. Yeah, the Shanghai Municipal Police was an exciting and eventful place to work. So in 1917, there was an incident where one of the British officers was shot and killed by a couple of Chinese gang members. And they decided at this point that this was motive to reform the tactics of the police. And this is where Fairbairn really got his start, where the administration of the police was willing to finally start listening to him on some of the changes that he wanted to make. And these changes involved really making firearms practice and training far more practical with the municipal police. So no more of the stand up straight and aim one-handed and marksmanship style competition pistol shooting is the standard and that's how the men practice. No, what Fairbairn instituted was a system of far more practical shooting. It involved a lot of shooting from retention, instinctive shooting where you're shooting from the hip. I can't really demonstrate that because I'm sitting down so you can't see my hand, but the idea of it is very important to get the first shot off. It's great to get the first shot off and make a hit, but getting the first shot off, even if it's a miss, is still very valuable because it will disorient your opponent. Practice shooting under stress, practice shooting at moving targets, unpredictably moving targets, bobbing targets, shooting in confined quarters, shooting in the dark. All of these things Fairbairn instituted. And in fact, I have a section here, a little paragraph written by one of his students that I think is worth reading. This describes a shoot house, I believe he called it the Mystery House, that Fairbairn built on the practice range, the Gordon Road practice range in Shanghai for the municipal police. And this is the sort of thing that they were practicing in the 1920s. If you'll permit me, this comes from Gentleman and Warrior, The Legend of W.E. Fairbairn, The Shanghai Years by Peter Robbins. To quote Baum, quote, "This string," the last segment of the practice session, "is fired inside a bomb-proof," which is basically a sandbagged, it's the equivalent of a 360 shoot house, to prevent wild shots from injuring anyone. The shooter takes his position outside the door, which leads into a dark passageway. Upon opening the door, he is permitted to draw and load his pistol. The passageway is dark and littered with chairs, boxes, or short stairs, in fact many things to cause extreme care in walking. At the end of the passage is another door leading into a dimly lit room. The shooter must push open this door and step into the room. Immediately he steps into the room, he must be prepared to shoot at whatever target he sees representing a human being. As soon as the shooter clears the threshold, firecrackers, confetti, sticks, and other objects are thrown at him, someone yells at his ear, pistols are fired behind him, and everything possible is done to shake his nerve and disconcert him. A target representing the head and shoulders of a man swings out from behind a wall, remaining in sight only momentarily. A puntung target slides across the end of the room, a head appears at the edge of the table, or a dummy is dropped into the room from above to represent a man springing down. Only 3 targets are shown, and the shooter is permitted only 1 shot at each target. These targets are marked as previously described in 5, 4, and 3-point sectors for scoring hits. That is not staid and proper colonial marksmanship target shooting. That is actual practical shooting under stress. The idea of having people firing behind you and throwing firecrackers at you that's something that is rather uncommon to see even today, except at the highest levels of training. And that is the sort of thing that was largely pioneered by William Fairbairn. He would go on to cross-train effectively with police. He spent 6 weeks with the NYPD in New York, studying with them and observing how they operated. That was fairly early. That was, I think, 1918, 1919. He spent time in Britain studying with British police. He was awarded a British military revolver instructor's certificate. A little bit of a funny thing. He was sent to revolver instructor's class, obviously having way more experience than virtually anyone else in the class, but he totally hid that, pretended to be a novice like everyone else, and was only outed, essentially, when he thought he was alone on the range and started practicing some of his instinctive shooting and hip shooting, and did quite well at it, only to later realize that he was being watched by some of the instructors who were like, you know more than you're letting on. We're going to have you instruct some classes on that sort of stuff. Anyway, in 1925, the practical side of the Shanghai Municipal Police shooting school, essentially, took another step forward when they formed what they called the Reserve Unit, or the Riot Squad. And this was essentially, as Leroy Thompson's book points out, the world's first SWAT team. It was intended to be, it was first formed as a riot squad because riots and demonstrations were not that uncommon in Shanghai at the time. However, it quickly also became essentially a SWAT team. It was used for raids on gang buildings, raids on, well, any sort of building raid that they needed to do, hostage rescue operations, special operations. You know, if they knew they were going to be confronting a number of serious armed criminals, well, they'd send in the reserve unit. And Fairbairn would command the reserve unit from 1925 until 1935. These guys pioneered, again, a lot of the tactics and techniques that today we kind of take for granted. For example, the idea of, if you're going to assault a building, you have a stack of men who are going in. The man in front has a ballistic shield and a handgun. The rest of the men are armed with a combination of handguns and submachine guns. In this case, it was primarily Thompson guns. They have overwatch being provided by snipers. That's kind of like, if I told you that's how a SWAT team was organized today, you'd say, yes, of course it is. But that is a technique that was largely pioneered by William Fairbairn and the Shanghai Municipal Police in the late 1920s. They developed bulletproof body armor for the men. They had a couple levels of bulletproof vests. They had just a pistol-proof vest. They developed from that a more protective armor vest that was proof against Mauser pistols, which is to say the C96, firing its .30 Mauser cartridge, which is particularly high velocity and has a lot better penetration than most of the other handguns that were available at the time, which are typically .32s and revolvers. So a lot of really cutting-edge work. In 1935, Fairbairn was promoted again out of the reserve unit, now up to assistant commissioner of the entire police force, but he remained devoted to active engagement with his men on operations. And in fact, he deployed himself to assist in what essentially was a gunfight, a raid on a drug house. In 1940, about 3 weeks before he was scheduled to retire and go back to England. So, he's leaving in 3 weeks and he's still deliberately putting himself in danger. He was very fortunate. Well, he was both skillful and fortunate. He was never actually shot during the course of his entire 33 years on the Shanghai Municipal Police Force. Did get into a number of scuffles, some broken bones, that sort of thing, but was never actually shot. So in 1940, his time with the police finally came to an end. War was brewing. The Japanese presence in Shanghai was going from one of ally of the British to not so much ally of the British. People could kind of see that the situation was deteriorating. By this time, I should mention Eric Sykes, or Bill Sykes, was a longtime friend of Fairbairn. They met on the police force. Sykes was originally actually a representative, a factory rep for the Remington Company in the United States, and that's where some of their initial cooperation came from, was Fairbairn looking for arms for the police force. Anyway, they became longtime friends and decided to work together after leaving Shanghai, and that's what happened when they went back to the UK. They took their knowledge of hand-to-hand combat and of close quarters firearms, combat tactics, and their decades of experience in what was essentially the most dangerous criminal city in the world at the time, Shanghai, and turned that into combat training for British forces and also United States forces during World War II. Now, I mentioned earlier on that some of the adoption of these techniques by the U.S. Marine Corps predate World War II. That's because the United States deployed Marines to Shanghai on and off for many years to help protect American interests in the international settlement. And those Marines worked very closely with the Shanghai Municipal Police, and a lot of them had a chance to train and work side by side with men like Fairbairn. So a lot of his techniques kind of were adopted by the China Marines, and then brought back to the United States, as well as being specifically and deliberately trained during World War II. So Fairbairn would go on to live long past the war. Eric Sykes died in 1945. But really, I think he's truly a fascinating person. And there's so much more to what he did than just the fighting knife and the training of commandos that I think he's generally recognized for today, that I wanted to comment on some of that. I have some videos on the Colt 1908 pistol that was a gun specifically chosen by Fairbairn for the Chinese officers of the Shanghai Municipal Police. I'll link to that video at the end here. Definitely check it out if you're interested. If you want to know more about him, I highly recommend both of these books, The World's First SWAT Team by Leroy Thompson and The Legend of W.E. Fairbairn, Gentleman and Warrior by Peter Robbins. I'll have links to where you can get them both on Amazon. And of course, there is a bit on Fairbairn in my own book, Pistols of the Warlords. So check that out if you haven't seen it. Thanks for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed this.